Alright, the next job is to glue the fingerboard onto the neck, but I can't do that until I've routed a very small little rounded area here to make allowance for the Allen key. So you might remember this little nut actually is not perfectly flush. It protrudes a little bit. If I use this fret rocker, you can see that it actually protrudes above the flush surface of the neck. So I need to make allowance for that before I can glue the fingerboard on, otherwise it's not going to be a good join. So I'm going to start by flipping this over and drawing a template outline on the back that I can use to kind of see where everything's going to be on the back. Okay, so now I've got a copy of the template lines on both sides, so I know what I'm going to be doing on this side. So the rounded area I need to route is going to be about 22 mil. And the area that I'm going to route doesn't have to be as wide as that channel. It really just has to be a couple of millimeters wide to allow for the top edge of that cylinder. So to do this, I'm going to use this little rounded cove bit, which is going to cut a little channel, very narrow, very shallow channel, just about 22 millimeters in, a couple of mils wide, and that will allow the fingerboard to sit on there nice and flush. Okay, I've only set up one guide for my router this time. I'm just going to, I don't think I need to, I can just run it along, pressing it along this guide on the left. It's all lined up, I can see what I'm doing, so there it is, looks really nice and neat. So it's going to allow the fingerboard to sit flush. It's going to allow the Allen key to turn freely in that cavity. So I've taken the liberty of clamping the fingerboard to the neck exactly as it will be when it's glued. And what I'm about to do is, before I can glue this, because you've only got a certain amount of working time before the glue, you've got to get it in the right place, and you don't want the glue to become unworkable during that time. So what you tend to do is you tend to drill a couple of holes in the fingerboard right through the board into the neck to install what's called locating pins. And the most common type of locating pin is a toothpick. So this toothpick is made, or is 2 millimeters. Now I have a 2 millimeter drill bit, which I'm going to use to drill the pilot hole. I'll insert the locating pins and glue them in place with super glue, and then I can take my fingerboard off, put my wood glue down, and when I put the fingerboard back, all I have to do is click it back into the locating pins and everything goes right back where it's supposed to go. Apparently a lot of older guitars, if you take the fingerboards off, you can actually see the old locating pins underneath. It doesn't really matter too much where you drill them, but you'd want to drill one at either end of the fretboard. In my case, I'm going to drill, and you also don't want to drill in the center where the truss rod is, so I'm going to drill on the first fret. You actually drill right into the fret slot, and then I'm also going to drill up here at, say, maybe the 20th fret. So the idea is if you drill right through that fret slot, then later when you saw back through that slot, it cuts through any toothpick that might be there, and the fret itself will cover the hole because the fret itself is wider than 2 mil. That's the idea anyway. I'm a little worried I drilled that too deep. I think I might have gotten a bit too hasty there. Yeah, I really should have done that with a bit more care. So I've drilled about over 2 centimeters into that spot there, which means that when I go to carve the neck contour on the back, I'm probably going to encounter that hole on the other side. So I can fill it later, that's fine, but it's gonna there's going to be a little spot there probably, which is not really what I wanted, but okay. Just to make sure I don't do the same thing up here, I'm going to mark the depth of my drill bit at about 1 centimeter or so. Probably don't even need to go that deep actually. Luckily there's almost no mistake you can't fix when it comes to wood. So now I can unclamp the fingerboard, take the fingerboard off, and there's my 2 locating pinholes. So when I glue the toothpick in there and trim that a little bit, I can use that as an indexing pin to put that back on. Just going to show you a little tip for getting the toothpick to fit perfectly inside that indexing hole. At the moment the toothpick is like a fraction of a mil, just too big to really fit in there properly. So I'm going to cut it down to size a little bit. Take these fret nippers. These are usually used for cutting the ends of frets off, just to get that a bit tidier. Then I'm going to put the toothpick into my drill and just hand tighten it. I'm going to take this piece of sandpaper and run the drill in there. Beautiful. So now with a bit of super glue added, that's going to go right down to the bottom of the hole, and that means later if I happen to be contouring the back of the neck and I happen to come across that hole that I drilled that's way too deep, it's going to be filled all the way through with that toothpick, and it'll just appear as a little dot on the other side. Nothing to worry about. Alright, moment of truth. I've got my indexing pins already attached to the fingerboard, so I can pop that straight on when the time comes. I have to mask off the truss rod so that we don't get glue in there. So the way that's normally done is then you get an X-Acto knife like this, and you cut all the way around the truss rod cavity as neatly as you can. Of course you're going to get a little bit of glue going down to the truss rod cavity, like you can't help that, it's going to squeeze in there a little bit, but the idea of this approach is to just avoid any extra glue going in. That if you can avoid it, then you do this. Some people would even argue that this isn't necessary, but enough people seem to do it that I think it's worth me following their lead. The next thing I'm going to use this little piece of cardboard to spread the glue around. So I'm using Titebond original wood glue. I went all over Brisbane trying to find this. Most hardware stores don't stock this, they just store normal PVA wood glue, which is probably fine, but this seems to be what everyone uses, all the luthiers, so I figure if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. And you're supposed to put a nice even but fairly thin coat over the whole neck, so that's my best guess. And use a card or something to spread. It's hard to really know how much is the right amount. I'm just going with what I've seen. Too thin is probably worse than too thick, I guess. I might wipe a little bit of glue around my indexing pin, because as I said, it's going to plug that hole, and possibly it's going to be visible later when I contour the neck. So I just want to make sure it's really in that hole well. Here we go. Oh, whew, nearly forgot about the tape. That would have been another stupid mistake. These are some slightly older clamps that I've got, and I'm worried about the metal parts scratching the wood a little bit, so I'm just going to put some a little wood block and some baking paper, which will stop the glue sticking. Alright, there it is. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 clamps on there. I don't really know how tight to make them, so I just made them about as tight as I thought, so they really won't move anymore, but I don't want to warp the wood or anything. So if we get down low here, you can see that there's a pretty good amount of squeeze out along the length of the neck. That's kind of what I was aiming for. I think that's probably pretty good. That'll all sand off once it's dried. Same thing on the other side here, all the way down. Good amount of squeeze out. Alright, I'm going to leave this to dry for about 24 hours. Okay, it's been about 24 hours. I took the clamps off after about 8 hours. According to the manufacturer's instructions on the glue, 24 hours should be about as cured as it's going to get, but I'm just going to leave it a little bit longer just in case. There's a reasonable amount of squeeze out all the way through. There is one area that I'm a little bit concerned about, just down here towards the heel. I've noticed, I don't know if you can see it, a very slim black line between the neck and the fingerboard that looks like it might be a gap. I'm not sure yet. It could just be an optical illusion. It could be something that disappears once I sand this to the final thickness. That it'll, if there is a gap, it may just disappear and these will blend into each other. If there is a gap, maybe I can patch it or fill it anyway. But that's an area that I'm just keeping an eye on. So the locating pins have done their job nicely. They helped to kind of center the fretboard where it was going to go. And if you look on the back here, you can see that I've glued the fingerboard on at an angle because as we determined, the fret slots weren't quite square, so I had to do a new center line, and that's what's been aligned to the neck. So the next job here is to trim off all of the excess material around the edge of the neck, get rid of that so that it's all flush, and get the neck, at least the fingerboard section, probably to its final width. Probably the way most people would do it is they would take a router bit like this with a bearing edge, and they'd run that around the edge, and that would trim the fingerboard completely flush to the neck. Given the bad luck I had with my previous router experience, I'm a bit shy to use that without a bit more practice. So I think I'm actually going to trim this off roughly with the spindle sander and then gradually approach my final width using a sanding beam. It's going to be slower, it's going to take longer, but it'll just be a bit of a gentler process and I can be a bit more precise. Okay, so it's looking a lot more like a neck now. I've probably trimmed it to within, you know, a millimetre or so around the edges, and now I'm gonna sand with a sanding beam. So I'm basically trying to hog off more material from the sides. I have about a millimetre on each side to remove, and after the sanding was just going really slow, so I tried the Shinto rasp, and this seems to be working much better. I just got to be careful I don't gouge anything that I'm not meant to, but it is actually going quite slow if you don't press too hard. I'm gradually working my way down to the final width. Okay, so this is starting to clean up really nicely now. A lot of the ugly router marks and burn marks along the side are gone, and it's a really nice clean seam along between the fingerboard and the neck. On this side I've got a little bit more work to do to get this one the same. I've got router gouge marks and still a bit of glue, but it's feeling pretty smooth, and it's basically 45 millimeters at the nut at the moment, so I've got a whole another millimeter I can take it down, so I'll probably take a half a mil off this side, and that'll probably take care of the gouge marks, and then I'll just keep massaging it from there. Getting pretty close now. This is the last little gouge mark, maybe a very faint one just there, and at the 12th fret I'm at 44.65 millimeters, so I've only got, you know, a little bit more than half a millimeter to take off there. And at the 14th fret, I'm actually very close. I'm less than half a mil off of what I need to be there. So I need to take a bit more off at the nut end and a bit less off at the heel end. Well, I think I'm basically there now. I've measured the nut and the 14th fret, and they're right where they need to be. In fact, I may have taken off a little bit too much because I've been sanding this with 80 grit, and I've got them to pretty much exactly the measurement I wanted, and I haven't done any fine sanding yet, so I've got to be very careful when I do that stage not to take off any more than absolutely necessary. So this may end up ever so slightly too narrow, but only by a couple of hundredths of a millimeter or something, so hopefully not a big deal. Alright, so this is looking pretty clean there. So in the process of sanding the heel flat and clean, I've actually lost the radius on those two corners, which I did kind of have there, so I'm going to have to redo those. So I'm going to use this little bearing again. Okay, this area is pretty good now, like geometrically at least. So the weird thing is this all feels super smooth right now, which is kind of what matters, but it doesn't look smooth. It kind of looks like there's scratch marks and contours and stuff, but I can't feel them, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. I might just leave it for now, because functionally this is all shaped really nicely. Just cosmetically it might need a little bit of rubbing or scraping or something just to get the last few scratches out.